Tonight, we explore the dark legacies of men who wore the papal crown, not to guide souls, but to dominate, exploit, and deceive. From orgies in the Vatican to alliances with assassins, the worst popes in history remind us that not every man who sat on the throne of St. Peter was a saint. Some were tyrants, some were perverts, some were killers in robes. So before you get comfortable, as always, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel only if you enjoy our content. Let us know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Sometimes our stories are too interesting, and we're working on some boring ones to help you sleep. But not tonight. Dim the lights, turn on a fan for some white noise, and let's cover what we have for tonight. Together. Pope John XII, the teen pope of sin. He was just 18 when he became the most powerful religious figure in the Western world, a boy, crowned pope, with no experience, no spiritual depth, and no intention of leading a holy life. John XII, born Octavianus, inherited the papacy in the year 955, thanks to the influence of his powerful father, Alberic II of Spoleto, who essentially installed his own son as pope while on his deathbed. But what followed was not a legacy of sacred devotion. It was a descent into scandal, violence, and unrestrained vice. John XII didn't see the papacy as a divine calling. He treated it as a toy. Roman historians from the time accused him of turning the Lateran Palace, the papal residence, into a brothel. Prostitutes were welcomed in holy chambers. Sacred relics were pawned off to fund his pleasures. And rather than preaching the Gospels, he was said to toast to pagan gods during drunken feasts and gamble with his bishops. And it wasn't just moral collapse. It was political chaos, too. He angered many of his allies, especially the Holy Roman Emperor Otto I. Their alliance crumbled after John XII secretly negotiated with Otto's enemies. In response, Otto marched on Rome and forced a synod to investigate the Pope. The accusations brought forward by bishops were staggering: simony, murder, incest, and invoking demons. He was deposed, but not for long. John XII returned to power with the help of Roman mobs and immediately took revenge. He mutilated his enemies, executed bishops who dared oppose him, and resumed his debauchery. And then, just as suddenly as he appeared, his reign ended. In 964, the young pope died under mysterious and fittingly scandalous circumstances. One account claims he died after being struck by a jealous husband who caught him in bed with his wife. Another simply says he suffered a stroke while committing adultery. Whatever the truth, Pope John XII's short life was one of recklessness, lust, and betrayal. He didn't just stain the papacy, he defiled it. In the long shadow of church history, few names echo with as much disgrace. Pope Benedict IX, the pope who sold his soul, and the papacy. If John XII was the most depraved teenager to ever become pope, then Benedict IX was the most bizarre, and arguably the most corrupt. He became pope not once, not twice, but 3 separate times. Born Theophylactus of Tusculum, Benedict IX first took the papal throne in the year 1032. He was likely no older than 20, placed there by his powerful and aristocratic family. But this was no boy of virtue. Chroniclers called his reign a disgrace, accusing him of rape, adultery, and even black magic. He was known to host wild orgies inside Vatican grounds, and was so hated that even the Roman people, used to political corruption, demanded his removal. But Benedict wasn't interested in reform. He was interested in pleasure. His first papacy ended when he was driven out by a rebellion, but he returned shortly after, then left again, then returned again. In a move that stunned even the most cynical observers of the time, Benedict IX decided to do something that would forever stain the reputation of the Church. He sold the papacy. Yes, literally, for gold. He approached his godfather, the archpriest John Gratian, and offered him the papal seat for a price. Gratian, later known as Pope Gregory VI, accepted, though reportedly to bring peace to Rome. Still, the act was so scandalous that it set off a domino effect, plunging the Church into a legitimacy crisis. And Benedict wasn't done. After selling the title, he changed his mind and tried to reclaim it, twice. The church now had 3 men claiming to be pope at the same time. The situation grew so chaotic that Emperor Henry III had to step in, calling a council to resolve the mess. The result? All 3 were removed. A clean slate. Benedict IX was excommunicated, not once, not twice, but multiple times over the years, depending on which faction held control. He's remembered not just as one of the worst popes, but as one of the most bizarre, greedy, and shameless. The man who treated the throne of St. Peter like a game of musical chairs, a pope for sale, a soul auctioned. And Rome would never forget it. Pope Alexander VI, the House of Borgia's crowned serpent. If there's one name that dominates every conversation about corruption in the Catholic Church, it's Borgia. Rodrigo Borgia, crowned as Pope Alexander VI in 1492, didn't just bring scandal to the papacy, he defined it. From the moment he assumed power, his reign was steeped in nepotism, bribery, and personal ambition. Alexander didn't rise through spiritual merit. He bought his way into the highest office in Christendom. The conclave that elected him was notorious for backroom deals and lavish bribes. And once he was enthroned, he wasted no time securing positions of wealth and power for his family. His papacy wasn't about shepherding souls. It was about expanding the Borgia dynasty. He openly acknowledged multiple children, including Cesare and Lucrezia, figures whose own reputations are soaked in legend, intrigue, and rumour. Cesare, a cardinal-turned-warrior, acted more like a mafia don than a church leader. Lucrezia was accused, perhaps unfairly, of incest, poisonings, and manipulating powerful men. But Alexander himself was no cleaner. He held lavish orgies inside the Vatican. One of the most infamous was the Banquet of Chestnuts, where 24 prostitutes were invited to entertain guests, while the Pope allegedly watched from his throne. Dancers performed naked. Coins were tossed to see who could catch them with anything but their hands. Meanwhile, Alexander sold cardinalships to the highest bidder, regardless of merit. The church became a market, and faith became a currency. Yet, strangely, he was also a skilled administrator. He strengthened the papal states, reformed certain bureaucracies, and even commissioned art. But none of that could wash away the filth that surrounded him. He died in 1503 under suspicious circumstances, some say poisoned by mistake while plotting to kill a rival. Even in death, the Borgia name lingered like incense clinging to a ruined chapel. He was buried with little ceremony, his body so bloated from decay that it reportedly wouldn't fit into his coffin. To this day, Pope Alexander VI is remembered as the most scandalous pope in history. He didn't just defile the sanctity of the Church, he weaponized it. Under his rule, the Vatican became a throne room of ambition, lust, and whispered deaths. Pope Stephen VI, the cadaver trial. Some papal scandals stain the Church with greed, others with lust, but what Pope Stephen VI did was so macabre, so surreal, it bordered on the theatrical. It's remembered today as the Cadaver Synod, a trial unlike any other in history. The year was 897. Rome was in chaos, torn between rival factions. And Stephen VI, a pope placed in power by the powerful Spolitan family, wanted revenge on his predecessor, Pope Formosus. But there was one problem. Formosus was already dead. So Stephen had his decomposing corpse dug up from its tomb, dressed in full papal regalia, and dragged into the Lateran Basilica to stand trial. Yes, a dead pope, seated on a throne, propped up by attendants, was placed on trial for alleged crimes. The charges? Perjury, violating canon law, and unlawfully ascending to the papacy. A deacon was assigned to speak on behalf of the corpse, answering Stephen's shouted accusations while the audience looked on, horrified. As the trial unfolded, the body slumped and swayed. Eventually, Pope Stephen VI declared Formosus guilty. The sentence The corpse was stripped of its vestments, the papal fingers used for blessings were severed, and the body was thrown into the Tiber River. It was a grotesque spectacle, but also a deeply political move. By condemning Formosus, Stephen invalidated all the bishops and clergy he had ordained, clearing a path for his own supporters to rise. But the horror did not bring peace. The public was outraged. The cadaver synod triggered riots across Rome. Months later, Stephen was imprisoned. His enemies stormed his cell and strangled him to death. In the aftermath, the church tried to bury the episode, both literally and figuratively. Formosus's body was recovered and reburied with honour. Future popes nullified the cadaver synod's rulings and forbade such trials from ever happening again. But the damage was done. Pope Stephen VI's legacy is not one of leadership, doctrine, or devotion. It is the image of a corpse on trial, a moment that turned the Vatican into a theatre of the absurd. Even in death, the papacy was not safe from the wrath of politics. Pope Urban VI, the tyrant in white. While many corrupt popes masked their sins with charm or indulgence, Pope Urban VI made no such effort. His reign, beginning in 1378, was marked not by quiet scandal, but by open hostility, paranoia, and terrifying violence. Urban VI was elected during a time of tension. The cardinals, fearing Roman mobs, chose an Italian, Bartolomeo Prignano, hoping to calm the locals. But they soon regretted their decision. Urban turned out to be volatile, suspicious, and cruel. He rejected advice, berated his cardinals in public, and reportedly beat his staff for minor errors. He didn't just rule with an iron fist. He ruled with clenched teeth and a red face. His paranoia grew rapidly. He believed that his own cardinals were plotting against him, and instead of addressing their concerns, he responded with violence. When several cardinals conspired to oppose him, or perhaps just escape his wrath, he had them imprisoned, then tortured. Reports from the time described their screams echoing through the Vatican walls. Some were brutally beaten, others slowly starved. 5 of them were executed without trial. Urban's instability led many to conclude that his election was invalid. A group of cardinals fled and elected a rival pope, Clement VII, based in Avignon. The result was one of the most damaging crises in church history, the Western Schism. For nearly 40 years, Europe was divided between 2, and sometimes even 3, competing popes. Different kingdoms backed different pontiffs, and beneath the surface, the unity of Christendom slowly fractured. Urban VI did not reconcile. He excommunicated his rivals and ruled with increasing isolation, surrounding himself with sycophants and brutes. As his mental health declined, so did the integrity of his reign. He alienated allies, destabilized Rome, and left the papacy stained with cruelty. He died in 1389, alone, bitter, and reviled. Pope Urban VI's reign is often overshadowed by the schism that followed. But his own actions, his rage, his violence, and his thirst for domination were the spark that set the church ablaze. He wasn't just a bad pope, he was a tyrant cloaked in holiness, and his shadow still lingers in the pages of papal history. Pope Leo X, the prince who bankrupted salvation. When Giovanni de' Medici became Pope Leo X in 1513, he wasn't stepping into a spiritual office, he was ascending a throne. Born into one of the richest families in Florence, Leo was a Renaissance prince long before he wore the papal tiara. And when he did, the Vatican became his playground. He once said, "God has given us the papacy. Let us enjoy it." And he did, extravagantly. Under Pope Leo X, the papal court ballooned into a theatre of luxury. Gold dripped from ceilings, feasts never ended, and artists like Raphael filled the Vatican with beauty. He was a lover of poetry, pageantry, and performance. But beneath the surface of high culture lay financial ruin and spiritual disaster. Leo drained church coffers to fund his Renaissance ambitions, and when he ran out of money, he found a new way to raise funds by selling salvation. He authorized the sale of indulgences, certificates that, for a price, promised to reduce punishment for sins. Priests across Europe stood in churchyards proclaiming, "As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs." It worked. Gold flowed into Rome, but outrage flowed faster. In 1517, a monk in Germany had enough. His name was Martin Luther, and he nailed his 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg, a direct protest against indulgences and papal corruption. How did Leo X respond? Not with humility or reform. He laughed it off, called Luther a drunken German who would change his mind when sober. When Luther didn't, Leo excommunicated him. It was a fatal miscalculation. The Reformation exploded. Churches broke away. The unity of Western Christendom shattered forever. To Leo, the church was a stage, and he was the star. But he couldn't see the cracks forming beneath his feet. He died in 1521, heavily in debt, unaware of the full fire he had lit. Pope Leo X is remembered less for the beauty he commissioned, and more for the schism he helped cause, not through heresy or war, but through pride, excess, and the commodification of grace. A prince of the Medici, a performer on a sacred stage, and a pope who lost the soul of Europe. Pope Sergius III, the father of the pornocracy. Long before the age of Borgia decadence or Renaissance indulgence, there was a pope who set a precedent for corruption that would echo through centuries. His name was Sergius III, and his reign in the early 10th century marked the beginning of what historians now call the pornocracy. Yes, the rule of harlots. Sergius III became pope in 904, after a bloody struggle in which his rivals were assassinated. It was an era where the papacy wasn't a divine office. It was a prize in a brutal Roman power game. And Sergius, ambitious and ruthless, was willing to kill for it. But it was his relationship with a noblewoman named Marozia that truly defined his papacy. Marozia belonged to the powerful Theophylact family, which essentially controlled Rome during this period. According to chroniclers, Sergius took her as his mistress while she was still a teenager. Their affair produced a child, who would later ascend the papal throne himself as Pope John XI. Yes, you heard that correctly. A pope fathered another pope. The Roman clergy whispered, the public grumbled, but none dared challenge him. Sergius ruled with an iron hand, restoring the memory of Pope Formosus, the same corpse tried in the infamous Cadaver Synod, only to have him recondemned, then buried again without honour. It was political vengeance disguised as papal authority. He filled the Curia with his supporters, sold church offices, and presided over what was arguably the most morally bankrupt period in papal history. While the Vatican should have been a beacon of spiritual leadership, it became a den of incestuous alliances and backdoor deals. The holiest office in Christendom had become a family business for Rome's elite. Under Sergius, the foundations of papal dignity cracked. He died in 911, still in power, still feared, but never revered. Pope Sergius III isn't as well known as the Borgias or the Medici popes, but his reign marked the beginning of nearly 60 years where the papacy was controlled by one Roman family, through seduction, manipulation, and bloodline. He was the father of the pornocracy, a pope not just corrupted by power, but entwined in a legacy of lust and hereditary sin. Pope Boniface VIII, the pope who declared himself God on earth. When Pope Boniface VIII rose to power in 1294, he inherited a papacy in crisis. His predecessor had resigned, a rare and humble act. Boniface, however, was the opposite of humble. He saw the papal throne not as a burden of service, but as a throne of domination. He famously declared, "I am Caesar, I am emperor." But it was his bull Unam Sanctum that truly captured the scale of his ego. In it, Boniface claimed that submission to the Pope was absolutely necessary for salvation. He placed himself above kings, above emperors, above everyone. He believed that not only did he rule the Church, but all of Christendom. And he meant it. Boniface tried to exert control over European monarchs, especially Philip IV of France. But Philip wasn't just any king. He was shrewd, ruthless, and deeply resentful of papal overreach. When Boniface issued edicts interfering with French taxation of clergy, Philip responded with accusations: heresy, immorality, and even witchcraft. What followed was unprecedented. In 1303, a group of armed men, led by a French ally, stormed the papal residence in Anagni. They slapped the Pope across the face, a literal blow to papal authority. For 3 days, Boniface was held prisoner, humiliated by the very monarch he had tried to dominate. Though he was eventually freed, the damage was done. Boniface VIII died shortly after, either from illness or, as some say, rage and humiliation. But his downfall didn't stop there. Years later, his body was exhumed by enemies who claimed it reeked of sulphur, a symbolic gesture accusing him of damnation. And when Dante Alighieri wrote the Divine Comedy, he placed Boniface in the 8th circle of hell, the place reserved for corrupt churchmen. Pope Boniface VIII is remembered as the man who pushed papal arrogance to its breaking point. He saw himself as the ultimate ruler, but in trying to become a god among men, he nearly destroyed the respect for the papacy altogether. His story is a cautionary tale. When sacred power is wielded without humility, it becomes tyranny cloaked in divinity. Pope Innocent III, the crusader of blood and fire. Don't be fooled by the name. Pope Innocent III was anything but innocent. Crowned in 1198, he was one of the most powerful popes in history, and one of the most dangerous. Unlike other corrupt pontiffs who indulged in personal pleasures, Innocent pursued power on a global scale. His weapon wasn't gold or women, it was holy war. Under his rule, the papacy became an empire of swords. Innocent III launched the Fourth Crusade, a military campaign supposedly meant to retake the Holy Land. But it never even reached Jerusalem. Instead, in a shocking twist, the Crusaders turned on Constantinople, the Christian capital of the Byzantine Empire. In 1204, they sacked the city, looted churches, raped nuns, and stole relics in the name of God. This wasn't just a military disaster, it was a spiritual betrayal. Innocent claimed he was outraged, but by the time his condemnation reached the Crusaders, they had already declared victory and sent him spoils of war. But perhaps even darker was the Albigensian Crusade, a war he declared not in the Middle East, but within Europe itself. In southern France, the Cathars, a Christian sect labelled heretical, were spreading ideas that threatened the Church's authority. Instead of sending theologians, Innocent sent knights. His message? Kill them all. God will sort them out. In 1209, the city of Béziers was attacked. When soldiers asked how to tell heretics from faithful Catholics, the response was chilling. Kill them all. Over 20,000 people were slaughtered, men, women, and children. Under Innocent III, the Church declared war on its own people. Heresy was punished with extermination, and the seeds of the Inquisition were quietly planted during his reign. He died in 1216, satisfied with his campaigns and reforms. And while he did centralize church power and reshape canon law, his legacy is stained with the blood of those he labelled enemies, even if they wore the cross. Pope Innocent III didn't just rule the church, he weaponized it. And his crusades, launched under banners of purity and salvation, remain among the darkest blots on Christian history. Long ago, where the sands of Iraq now stretch silent and bare, there stood a city unlike any other. Babylon, ancient, proud, and humming with life. It was a city of ziggurats and priests, of kings and scribes, of empires rising beneath stars that watched quietly from above. And at its heart, so the story goes, bloomed a garden that should not have been. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon. A wonder, they called it. A paradise not sprawled across fields but suspended in the air, layered in ascending terraces, each one bursting with colour and life. towering palms, fragrant myrrh, vines that curled and draped like green waterfalls. Water, the very essence of life, flowing through stone channels and trickling down walls, feeding fruit trees that should never have thrived in that dry, blistering heat. To stand before it, they said, was like seeing a mountain made of gardens, a man-made Eden that rose up from the earth and challenged the very laws of nature, a miracle of engineering, a triumph of imagination, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. But here is the question that haunts historians, archaeologists, and dreamers alike. Did it really exist? There are no Babylonian tablets that mention it, no inscriptions, no ruins we can point to and say, here it stood. All we have are the accounts of later Greek and Roman writers, like Strabo and Philo of Byzantium, who described the gardens with awe, but from a distance of centuries. Could something so grand, so seemingly impossible, have simply vanished? Or worse, have never been there at all? And yet, the legend endures. Perhaps it's because the story is too beautiful to let go. The idea that in a sun-scorched empire of dust and conquest, a king might build something purely for love, a garden for his homesick queen, who longed for the green hills of her native land. That image has never left us. It lingers in poems, in paintings, in whispered hopes that somewhere beneath the ruins, roots still sleep in silence. The hanging gardens may be lost, or never real, but the mystery? The mystery is very much alive. To understand the gardens, we must first understand the city said to cradle them, Babylon. Situated along the Euphrates River in what is now modern-day Iraq, Babylon wasn't just a city. It was a statement. Massive walls wide enough for chariots to race atop, towering temples, the famed Ishtar Gate, glazed in deep blue and adorned with golden lions and dragons. Babylon was the jewel of Mesopotamia, the pride of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, and at its centre stood King Nebuchadnezzar II, the man most often credited with building the Hanging Gardens. He reigned in the 6th century BCE, a master builder and conqueror, who transformed the city into an architectural marvel. Under his rule, Babylon became a city of unprecedented scale, filled with temples, palaces, and ziggurats that reached skyward like mountains of mud brick and faith. But among the stone and ceremony, one story stands apart. A tale whispered by later Greek historians that Nebuchadnezzar had married a woman from the distant forested land of Media, possibly Queen Amytis, and that she, homesick for the green hills of her childhood, found only flat desert and endless dust in Babylon. So, the king built her a garden. Not just a courtyard or a grove, but a structure so vast and intricate that it seemed to hang in the air, layered like the hills she missed. An offering of greenery in a land of fire, a gift of love wrapped in engineering. This version of the story is deeply romantic, almost too perfect, and yet it persists. Greek historians, such as Strabo and Diodorus Siculus, described the gardens centuries later, writing of terraces stacked like steps to heaven, of irrigation systems lifting water from the river to the highest levels. They wrote with confidence, even though they had never seen the gardens themselves. So, was this a real architectural marvel, or the ancient world's most enduring fairy tale? In a city as ambitious as Babylon, ruled by a king who reshaped landscapes, it's not hard to believe he might attempt such a feat. And perhaps, in the cracks between myth and memory, there once bloomed something truly extraordinary. A dream made of stone, water, and longing. If the hanging gardens were real, they were more than a testament to beauty. They were a miracle of ancient engineering. Imagine trying to grow a mountaintop garden in the middle of a desert. Not just ground-level plants, but full-grown trees, shrubs, and flowering vines suspended over stone, in blazing heat, with little rainfall, and no natural hills to build upon. To keep such a garden alive, the ancients would have needed more than green thumbs. They would have needed genius. Greek accounts give us clues. They describe terraces stacked like steps, built atop vaulted foundations made of baked brick and asphalt. The soil was layered thick, deep enough to root tall trees. But more astonishing than the architecture was the irrigation. How, in an age without modern pumps, could water be lifted from the Euphrates River to the uppermost levels of the garden? The answer may lie in a device known even then, the Archimedean screw, or a similar early water lifting mechanism. A spiraling tube housed in a cylinder, turned by hand or foot, raising water upward through rotation. If the Babylonians had something like it, and there's reason to believe they did, it could have allowed for a continuous flow, feeding cascading streams that trickled from one level to the next. The system would have had to be maintained constantly, a living machine, not just an ornament. Channels carved through stone, gutters hidden beneath the foliage, workers tending to the pipes as well as the plants, and all of it concealed beneath a blanket of leaves and blossoms, so that to the outsider, the garden appeared to breathe on its own. To the ancients who saw it, or who believed they did, it must have seemed like magic. A floating forest, a hill sculpted from water and will, something no other city could claim. But to today's archaeologists, it raises questions. Could such technology have existed in 6th century BCE Babylon? Or are we underestimating what ancient minds could achieve with enough ambition and a king's love? Perhaps that's what made the Hanging Gardens so wondrous. Not just their beauty, but the quiet message they carried. That even in a desert, the impossible could grow. As magnificent as the Hanging Gardens sound, there's a strange silence at the core of their story. A silence that has puzzled scholars for centuries. While later Greek and Roman writers spoke of them in vivid detail, Babylonian sources, the people who would have built and lived among these gardens, say nothing. There are no surviving tablets, no royal inscriptions, no temple records that describe such a garden. And this is odd, because the Babylonians were meticulous record keepers. They wrote about crops, taxes, gods, even the dimensions of buildings and the names of their architects. Yet nowhere do we find a single Babylonian line that confirms the existence of a massive terraced garden rising above their capital. Even King Nebuchadnezzar II, the ruler most often credited with creating the gardens, left behind thousands of cuneiform inscriptions. He boasts of temples, walls, palaces, but never a word about a wonder made for his queen. No mention of terraces, no reference to an elevated Eden. And that silence matters. If the gardens had truly existed in the heart of Babylon, why would their creator omit them from the long list of his achievements? Why would scribes and priests, who detailed every corner of Babylonian religious life, ignore a garden said to rival paradise? Some argue that the gardens were destroyed early, vanishing long before Greek writers ever laid eyes on Babylon. Others suggest the gardens were not in Babylon at all, but somewhere else entirely, misattributed by foreign historians trying to reconstruct the world from hearsay and fragments. One theory points to Nineveh, the capital of Assyria, where the Assyrian king Sennacherib wrote of gardens watered by aqueducts and an elaborate water-raising device. Could the Greek authors have confused one Mesopotamian city for another? Or perhaps the gardens never existed, not physically. Perhaps they were always a symbol, a myth told and retold until it took on the weight of truth. A fantasy of paradise built in the mind of a faraway writer, meant to impress, to inspire, to astonish. But myths are never meaningless. Even in their silence, the Babylonians left us a puzzle, a space where wonder grows wild, fed not by fact, but by yearning. Though Babylon's own records remained silent, the Greek historians spoke clearly and passionately. One of the most cited descriptions of the Hanging Gardens comes from Strabo, a geographer writing in the 1st century BCE. He never saw the gardens himself, but he passed along stories from earlier sources. Strabo described terraced platforms rising one above the other, supported by stone columns. He spoke of how water was drawn from the Euphrates using mechanical devices, perhaps the earliest reference to a water-lifting screw. and of a garden so large and elevated that it truly seemed to hang in the air. Another powerful account came from Diodorus Siculus, writing around the same time. He offered vivid detail. Trees planted in deep layers of earth, stone walkways wide enough for chariots, and complex irrigation channels hidden beneath the greenery. He claimed that the gardens had been built by a king to comfort a queen. Both writers described a marvel beyond comprehension, a mountain made by human hands, a structure that defied the flat, dry landscape of Mesopotamia. And they weren't alone. Several Greek and Roman authors echoed similar tales. But here's the tension. These descriptions, though elaborate, were all second-hand. None of the authors had visited Babylon during the height of its splendor. Many were writing centuries after the supposed construction of the gardens. By then, Babylon was already fading, a crumbling memory on the edge of the known world. Were these accounts based on oral tradition, embellished travelers' tales, or were they distorted echoes of something once real, now swallowed by time? Still, these descriptions endured. For the Greeks, who revered order, beauty, and harmony with nature, the image of a lush, tiered paradise rising from the desert must have seemed like the perfect synthesis of human power and artistic vision. Whether real or exaggerated, the stories passed from scroll to scroll, century to century, until the Hanging Gardens became one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, a title not easily earned and never forgotten. Sometimes, we believe in things not because we can prove them, but because the world feels richer if they were true. If the Hanging Gardens weren't in Babylon, then where were they? One of the most compelling alternate theories comes not from denial, but from redirection. In the 20th century, a new voice emerged, that of Dr. Stephanie Dalley, a British Assyriologist who challenged the long-standing assumption that Babylon was the home of the Hanging Gardens. After decades of study, she proposed something radical. The gardens were real, but they were built in Nineveh, not Babylon. Nineveh, once the glittering capital of the Assyrian Empire, sat farther north along the Tigris River. Its great king, Sennacherib, ruled in the 7th century BCE, about a century before Nebuchadnezzar's time. And unlike Babylon, Sennacherib left behind records, clay tablets filled with pride and detail. In these inscriptions, he described a magnificent palace garden filled with exotic plants, fruit trees, and a massive aqueduct that brought water from the mountains 50 kilometers away. He even mentions a water-lifting screw, the same technology that Greek authors would later attribute to the Hanging Gardens. Could it be that what the Greeks described was based not on Babylonian glory, but on tales of Assyrian engineering, misunderstood or misattributed across time? Dalley also pointed out that the ancient word Babylon could mean more than one place. The Assyrians sometimes used it to refer to gateways of the gods, sacred cities, not just the city of Babylon itself. In this light, Nineveh may have been another Babylon, and the gardens, in fact, never moved at all. Only the name did. This theory doesn't erase the gardens. It relocates them, and in doing so, it brings clarity to the silence of Babylon and the boldness of Assyrian records. It suggests that the wonder was not imagined, just misunderstood. If true, it would mean the Hanging Gardens did exist, just not in the city we expected. It would make Sennacherib the creator, not Nebuchadnezzar. And it would rewrite one of the world's oldest architectural mysteries. Sometimes legends don't vanish. They simply shift places, hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone to read the ancient lines just a little differently. Beyond the bricks and aqueducts, beyond all the historical debates and archaeological theories, the story of the Hanging Gardens is also a love story, soft, persistent, and human. According to later tradition, King Nebuchadnezzar II did not build the gardens out of pride, nor as a temple, nor as a display of imperial power. He built them for Amytis, his queen, a woman far from home. Amytis was said to be a princess from Media, a land of rolling hills, cool breezes, and forests that whispered with green. When she married into the Babylonian court, she entered a world of heat and dust, endless flatlands, brown brick walls, and a sun that rarely relented. And so, the legend goes, the king saw her sadness, and answered it with a garden. He ordered the creation of a mountain in the middle of the city, not one made of earth and stone alone, but one woven with vines, scattered with blossoms, and breathing with water. He called on architects, engineers, and slaves to raise a monument not of conquest, but of comfort, a piece of her homeland, sculpted in the very heart of his. This is not a confirmed fact. No Babylonian text records her name. No tablets speak her sorrow. But the tale has echoed through time for a reason, because it's easy to imagine, easy to believe, that in the centre of one of the world's greatest cities, a king once tried to make a single soul feel less alone. And perhaps that's what gives the Hanging Gardens their enduring power. Not just that they were beautiful, not just that they defied gravity, but that they were born, at least in story, from devotion, not to a god, but to a woman. In that version of the tale, the garden becomes more than architecture. It becomes a quiet rebellion. In a world shaped by war and empire, someone built something not to dominate, but to heal. Stone by stone, leaf by leaf, drop by drop. Even if the gardens never existed, the love that built them still does. If the Hanging Gardens were once real, where did they go? Great wonders often fall not with a crash, but with a whisper, slowly, quietly, over generations. Time doesn't just erase buildings, it buries them in silence. And Babylon, once the jewel of Mesopotamia, was no exception. The city endured centuries of conquest and decay. After the fall of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, it passed into the hands of the Persians, then the Greeks, then the Parthians. Each ruler left a mark, but none maintained the splendor that Nebuchadnezzar had built. Babylon's bricks were torn down to construct new cities. Earthquakes and erosion took their toll. Sand swept in from the desert, burying gardens and gates alike. By the time Alexander the Great arrived in the 4th century BCE, Babylon was a fading echo. He dreamed of restoring it, even making it the capital of his empire. But death claimed him before the dream could take shape. Without a patron, the city was left to rot. No one knows exactly when the gardens vanished. Perhaps they were dismantled. Perhaps they collapsed from neglect. Or perhaps they never stood at all, existing only in the pages of foreign writers who had heard a story too good to question. In the 19th and 20th centuries, archaeologists uncovered the foundations of Babylon's grand ziggurats and palaces. But no trace of the gardens has ever been definitively found. The absence is heavy. It lingers like the space where a great tree once stood, roots gone, but the shape of its shade still remembered. Even if they once towered in reality, the Hanging Gardens have now passed into a different kind of truth, the truth of memory, myth, and longing. We search the ruins not just for brick or pipe, but for proof that such wonder was possible, that humanity, even in its earliest days, dreamed of beauty that reached upward. And maybe that's what makes their disappearance so haunting. Not that they vanished, but that they may have never existed at all. And yet, we still believe. Because the mind, like the desert, is a place where forgotten things can still bloom. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon, real or imagined, occupy a rare space in human history. We have no stones, no carvings, no ruins to stand before, and yet they remain one of the most vivid and beloved wonders of the ancient world. Why? Because some wonders live not in earth and mortar, but in the imagination. The idea of a garden reaching into the sky, blooming above a parched desert, fed by clever machines and crowned with cascading greenery. It speaks to something deeper than history. It taps into our longing to create beauty where it should not exist, to tame nature, to build joy from barren stone. Whether raised by Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon or by Sennacherib in Nineveh, or simply dreamed into being by Greek poets and travellers, the gardens remind us of what ancient people were capable of, and what they hoped for. In a world of conquest, someone dreamed of green. In a land of walls and war, someone imagined waterfalls and flowers. And isn't that enough? Even now, artists paint it. Writers write it. Engineers puzzle over it. Filmmakers render it in vivid digital forms. A place no one alive has seen. And yet, we all feel as if we have. We can picture it. The damp stone beneath bare feet. The scent of jasmine in the wind. The splash of water echoing through terraces. A garden not made to be conquered, but to be remembered. It's the possibility of the hanging gardens that makes them eternal. We dig for ruins and debate ancient texts because we want them to be real. But maybe the truth is, they already are, not in Mesopotamian soil, but in the collective memory of humanity. A shared vision passed from hand to hand, mind to mind, for more than 2,000 years, and in that way they have never disappeared. They hang still, not above Babylon, but above us all, suspended in time, blooming in silence, rooted in wonder, and sometimes, late at night, when the world grows quiet, we remember. Even in the hottest deserts of history, something green once grew. Before coins jingled in pockets and bills changed hands at markets, there was a time when humanity had no money, yet trade still flourished. It was a world of barter, where goods and services were exchanged directly. A farmer with a surplus of grain might trade it for fish from a nearby river. A skilled potter could swap bowls and jugs for woven cloth. It was a system built on mutual need. But bartering had its limits. Imagine this. You're a shepherd with 3 goats and you want salt. You find someone with salt, but they have no need for goats. The deal falls apart. This is known as the coincidence of wants, the challenge of finding someone who both has what you want and wants what you have. In small villages, where everyone knew one another, this was manageable. But as communities grew into cities, and cities into kingdoms, bartering became clumsy, slow, and impractical. The next step was to find something that could stand in for value, something that could be agreed upon by everyone, durable, portable, and ideally scarce. Early societies began to lean on objects that were easy to measure and hard to fake. Sometimes that meant using livestock. A goat might be worth 2 chickens or 10 measures of grain. In other cultures, it meant salt. In fact, the word salary comes from salarium, the Latin term for the salt rations paid to Roman soldiers. Other societies turned to tools and weapons, polished axe heads in the Stone Age, or bronze blades in ancient China, not necessarily to be used, but because they held clear value and could be exchanged. These were not yet money in the form we know today, but they were a bridge between barter and currency. They allowed people to assign abstract value to physical goods, and more importantly, they introduced the idea of value being stored and passed along. Before coins, before numbers stamped on silver discs, there was a far more ancient truth. People have always needed ways to trust each other in trade. And currency, in its earliest form, was simply a promise, carved not in paper or metal, but in human need. As human societies expanded and bartering grew too complex, a quiet transformation began. Communities started to adopt objects of agreed value, not because they were useful, but because everyone agreed they were valuable. This was the birth of proto-currency, the first stepping stones toward money as we know it. One of the earliest and most widespread forms was the cowrie shell. Small, smooth, and pearly white, these shells came from the Indian and Pacific Oceans. They were naturally beautiful, hard to counterfeit, and easy to carry. Cowries began to appear across vast regions, from Africa to China, used in trade, tribute, and even dowries. In some African kingdoms, large bags of cowries were stored in royal treasuries like modern bank vaults. In ancient China, Bronze imitations of cowries were cast and circulated like coins. But cowries weren't alone. In ancient Mesopotamia, people used measured silver, not coins, but weighed lumps, for trade. Merchants carried scales to weigh silver in shekels, and contracts recorded exact amounts. Silver had no standard shape or stamp yet, but it held value, especially in urban economies where accounting was key. Meanwhile, in Mesoamerica, the Aztecs used cacao beans as currency. These weren't just used to make chocolate. They were counted, stored, and protected like money. 10 beans might buy a rabbit. 100 could fetch a small woven cloak. In the Philippines, gold rings and bars called piloncitos were used in markets centuries before colonial influence. In some parts of Africa, iron tools, such as hoes or spears, were accepted in trade, not for their use, but for their consistent value. What connected all these systems was the shift in thinking. Value didn't need to be immediate or personal. It could be symbolic. A small shell or shiny metal could represent something larger: time, labour, or security. These early forms of currency changed how people interacted. Now, one didn't have to trade directly for a needed good. You could accept something of value today and use it later for something else entirely. Trust began to flow through tokens, objects, and numbers. Money was no longer about survival. It had become a language, spoken in cowries, beans, and bars of silver. As trade networks expanded and civilizations grew, so too did the need for more reliable and standardized forms of money. Trusting in cacao beans, cowries, or weighed silver worked, but only up to a point. What societies needed next was uniformity, money that didn't just represent value, but carried an authority behind it. This led to one of the most significant shifts in economic history: the rise of metal as money. Metals like gold, silver, copper, and bronze had already been used in trade for centuries. They were rare, durable, and could be melted and reshaped without losing value. But their use was still inconsistent. A piece of silver in one region might be accepted, but in another it would need to be tested, weighed, and judged all over again. So ancient cultures began shaping metal into consistent forms: bars, rings, and eventually coins. The key wasn't just the shape, it was the guarantee. Some of the earliest known coins came from the ancient kingdom of Lydia, in what is now Western Turkey, around 600 BCE. These coins were made of electrum, a natural alloy of gold and silver, and stamped with images, lions for example, as a mark of authenticity from the Lydian king. Now, the value wasn't just in the metal, it was in the seal. Stamped metal became a revolutionary idea. A coin meant something. It had weight, yes, but it also had the backing of a ruler, a state, or an empire. A person could accept a coin not just because it was shiny and heavy, but because they trusted that everyone else would accept it too. Soon, the idea spread. Greek city-states, the Persian Empire, Rome, India, and China all developed their own coinage systems. Each coin was a symbol of control, communication, and commerce. Kings and emperors printed their faces onto currency, not just for recognition, but for power. Every exchange carried their image, their name, their reach. In these stamped metals, money evolved. It became not just a means of trade, but a message that said, "This has value, because we say it does, and because you believe it." The idea of money truly changed the moment it became minted. Not just shaped metal, but officially authorized currency stamped by a ruling power. This wasn't just innovation, it was a declaration. As early as the 7th century BCE, the Lydians in Anatolia began producing coins made of electrum, a naturally occurring blend of gold and silver. These weren't decorative tokens. They were created for trade, each stamped with a lion's head, the royal emblem of King Aliates. These first coins didn't bear numbers. Instead, their weight and the authority of the stamp confirmed their worth. The practice caught on quickly. In nearby Greece, city-states began minting their own coins, using symbols of local identity. Owls for Athens, turtles for Aegina, Pegasus for Corinth. Each coin reflected pride, culture, and trust. Greek coins were not just currency. They were miniature pieces of propaganda, carried from one market to another. Over time, rulers discovered something else. Control over money meant control over people. If a king could decide what counted as money, he could influence trade, raise armies, and shape the economy of an entire region. In Persia, King Darius I introduced a gold coin called the daric, stamped with an image of the king himself holding a bow. It circulated across a vast empire, connecting lands from Egypt to India with one consistent form of money. Meanwhile, in China, early coins took on distinctive shapes: spades, knives, and round discs with square holes in the centre. Cast in bronze and bearing the marks of dynasties, these coins were strung together on ropes and worn like wallets around the waist. Their form reflected both utility and symbolism. Square representing the earth, and the circle, heaven. The act of minting money transformed how people experienced value. Coins became trusted tools, not just for local trade, but for long-distance exchange. Soldiers were paid in them, taxes were collected through them, markets grew around them, and with every stamped image, be it a god, a king, or a mythical beast, money whispered the same message. This is more than metal. This is power. This is law. This is order. Currency was no longer born of barter. It was born of command. As currency systems spread across the ancient world, no civilization refined, expanded, and standardized coinage like the Romans. For them, money wasn't just about trade, it was about empire. By the time of the Roman Republic, coins had become essential to everyday life. The Romans introduced a system based on bronze and silver, later adding gold as the empire grew wealthier. Their earliest coin, the AS Rood, was simply a chunk of bronze, but over time they began producing carefully weighed and stamped coins, each with a specific role in the economy and a story to tell. The denarius, minted in silver, became one of the most famous Roman coins. It was used for military salaries, civic payments, and trade across the empire. On one side, a Roman symbol, a god, a figure of victory, or a scene of conquest. On the other side, the face of the emperor. In this way, coins became political tools. Every transaction was also a moment of propaganda. The emperor's image placed directly into the hands of his people. It reminded them who ruled, even when they were simply buying bread or paying a tax. But Roman currency wasn't just powerful, it was complex. The empire used different metals, values, and mints scattered across regions. As Rome expanded, it absorbed the monetary systems of other cultures, reissuing local currencies under Roman authority. This brought consistency and order to trade from Britain to Judea. However, even empires can struggle with money. As the Roman economy faced military pressure and internal corruption, the state began debasing its currency, mixing less precious metal into silver and gold coins. Over time, the denarius lost its shine and its value. Inflation soared, trust in money declined. Still, the system endured for centuries. Roman coins travelled farther than Roman legions, showing up as far away as India and Scandinavia. They weren't just instruments of commerce, but symbols of Roman influence, carried in pockets, buried in hoards, lost in riverbeds. And when the empire fell, the coins remained, artifacts of a civilization that understood one simple truth. If you can control the coin, you can shape the world it flows through. While Rome was forging its empire through minted silver and bronze, the ancient civilizations of Asia were building their own rich histories of currency, often just as innovative, and in some ways far more enduring. In China, the evolution of money took a unique path. Early forms weren't round. They were shaped like tools: spade money, knife money, and later, bell-shaped coins. These reflected practical symbols of value, agriculture and labor. But as the need for standardized trade grew, the Chinese began producing round coins with square holes in the center. These could be strung together on cords, 1,000 coins tied in a loop, carried on a belt, or hidden in walls for safekeeping. The square hole wasn't just functional. It held cosmic symbolism. Round represented heaven, and the square symbolized earth, uniting the two in every transaction. These coins were typically made of bronze and marked with inscriptions declaring their origin, often tied to the emperor or the dynastic era. But unlike in Rome, where coins constantly changed with each new ruler, Chinese coinage stayed remarkably consistent in shape and style across centuries. In this continuity, there was stability. Further south and west, India developed its own early currency system. As far back as the 6th century BCE, small silver pieces called punch-marked coins were in circulation. They were irregular in shape, stamped with symbols like suns, elephants, or hills, not faces. These coins spoke of nature, religion, and power in a land where trade connected silk routes to seaports. Meanwhile, the vast network known as the Silk Road stretched across Asia, linking China, Central Asia, Persia, and the Mediterranean. Along it flowed silk, spices, porcelain, and money. Coins of Chinese emperors, Roman Caesars, and Persian kings all passed hand to hand, crossing deserts and mountains, carried by merchants, monks, and caravans. In the East, currency wasn't just about spending. It was about philosophy, stability, and identity. Coins became part of rituals, of offerings, of ancestral worship. Some were never meant to be used, only buried, burned, or gifted. And while empires rose and fell, the coins remained, quiet messengers from the past, whispering across centuries in the language of value. By the time metal coins had been circulating for over 1,000 years, another revolution was quietly unfolding, not in the West, but in China. There, among merchants, scholars, and dynasties, a new idea began to take root. Money didn't have to be heavy. It could be written. The first known use of paper money dates back to the Tang dynasty, around the 7th century CE. Initially, it wasn't official currency, just promissory notes issued by wealthy merchants and trusted lenders. Travellers across long distances found it easier to carry paper receipts than bags of bulky coins. The idea was simple. Instead of hauling silver, you carried a note promising payment in silver, backed by a reliable source. It wasn't long before the government took notice. By the 11th century, during the Song dynasty, China began issuing the world's first government-backed paper currency, known as jiaozi. These notes were printed with official seals, expiration dates, and intricate patterns to prevent counterfeiting. They were lighter, easier to transport, and incredibly efficient for large-scale trade. This invention came centuries before paper money appeared anywhere else in the world. While Europe still clinked with metal, China was trading with slips of ink-stamped mulberry bark. But paper money brought new risks. Coins had intrinsic value. They were made of metal that could be melted or repurposed. Paper, on the other hand, was only valuable because the government said it was. This required an entirely new kind of trust, not in gold, but in the promise behind the paper. Inflation became a danger. In times of political instability or overprinting, the value of paper could plummet. Still, the innovation stuck. The Yuan dynasty, under Mongol rule, expanded the use of paper money across their vast empire, even issuing notes in multiple languages. When Marco Polo arrived in China in the 13th century, he was stunned. He described the system in awe, noting that Kublai Khan's paper notes held power equal to the coin of the realm. To the European mind, it was alchemy, turning paper into gold. But the Chinese had simply realized something profound. Money was no longer a thing. It was a belief, a shared trust, printed, sealed, and carried like a whisper across continents. as trade routes stretched across continents and economies grew more complex. Carrying coins, or even paper notes, became risky and inefficient. Merchants needed a way to store value safely and move wealth without hauling heavy sacks of silver. And so, out of necessity, emerged one of the most transformative inventions in the history of money: the bank. The earliest banking systems appeared in the ancient world, in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Greece, but it was during the medieval period, particularly in the Islamic world and Renaissance Italy, that banking became institutionalized. In bustling cities like Baghdad, Cairo, and later Venice and Florence, wealthy merchant families began offering credit, loans, and deposit services. A trader in Cairo could deposit gold with a banker, receive a written note of credit, and then redeem it weeks later in Damascus, a system remarkably similar to modern checks. The most powerful of these institutions were not kings or priests, but families like the Medici, who financed voyages, wars, and empires. They didn't just store money, they moved it, multiplied it, and controlled it. At the core of this new system was a radical idea. Money did not need to exist physically at all times. You could have a promise, a ledger entry, and that alone could be traded, borrowed against, or invested. With that came the concept of credit, the trust that someone would repay their debt in the future. Entire networks of trade began operating not on coins, but on confidence. Banks issued letters of credit, notes, and eventually began creating money through lending. This shift transformed economies. Wealth could now move faster than caravans. Fortunes could be made not just by mining gold, but by lending it. A merchant's influence no longer depended on what he carried, but on what he was owed. Of course, with credit came risk. Defaults, fraud, and economic bubbles all grew in this new world of invisible wealth. But there was no turning back. Money had evolved once again, from object to symbol, and now to record. From copper coins to ink on paper, from silver in hand to trust in a ledger, currency was no longer just held. It was believed into being. Today, when you tap your phone to pay for coffee or transfer money across the globe with a click, you're engaging in a transaction that doesn't involve a single physical coin or bill. No metal, no paper, just numbers on a screen. And yet, the trade is real. The goods are exchanged. The system holds. We've entered the era of invisible money. From the shells and silver of ancient times, currency has now become code. Digital banking, online payments, cryptocurrencies, and central bank digital currencies are transforming what it means to own, store, and spend money. And for many, the idea of cash is slowly fading into memory. With a digital bank account, you no longer hold money, you access it. Your balance lives on a server, updated in real time, managed by systems you'll never see. Money now moves at the speed of light, crossing borders, buying stocks, funding startups, with zero physical form. And then there's cryptocurrency, a bold experiment in trust without authority. No king, no central bank, just blockchain, a decentralized ledger, verified by thousands of independent nodes. Bitcoin, Ethereum, and others don't exist in vaults. They exist only as math, and yet they're traded, stored, and even used to buy homes, cars, and art. We've come a long way from goats and grain, and yet the essence of money has never changed. Whether stamped in bronze, printed in ink, or rendered in lines of code, money is still built on the same ancient foundation: trust. The belief that this object, or screen or string of numbers, can be exchanged for something you want. It's a social contract, whispered across time, from barter to blockchain. The future of money may be cashless, contactless, and entirely digital, but its roots stretch backward, into clay tablets, silver scales, and gardens of cowrie shells. And no matter how modern it becomes, money will always be a story, told not just in numbers, but in the ancient human need to trade, to trust, and to believe in value where none exists. In the golden haze of Greek legend, no figure shines brighter or casts a longer shadow than Helen of Troy. She was said to be the daughter of Zeus and Leda, born not of a woman but from an egg. Her beauty, poets claimed, was unmatched, so powerful, so divine, that men went to war over her. Entire kingdoms bled for her name. Helen was queen of Sparta, married to King Menelaus, when Paris, a young Trojan prince, arrived. Some say he stole her, others say she followed willingly. Either way, when the sails of his ship disappeared over the horizon, the ancient world tilted into chaos. Menelaus, humiliated and furious, called upon the oath all of Helen's former suitors had sworn, the vow to protect her marriage, no matter who won her hand. And so, under the banner of honour and vengeance, Greece united. Kings gathered their ships, among them Agamemnon, the ambitious high king of Mycenae, Odysseus, the clever strategist of Ithaca, and Achilles, the half-divine warrior whose name would become legend. They sailed for Troy, a city said to be wealthy, fortified, and proud. 10 years they fought beneath its towering walls. Battles raged, heroes died, and gods took sides. Zeus and Hera, Apollo and Athena, all turned the war into a divine spectacle. The death of Patroclus, the rage of Achilles, the slaying of Hector, and finally, the trick of the wooden horse. That is the myth, a sweeping epic of passion, pride, and betrayal. But what of reality? For centuries, historians believed it was fiction, a beautiful lie told by poets like Homer, who wrote the Iliad centuries after the war supposedly occurred. Yet buried beneath the legend is something stubborn, something real. The city of Troy was not a fantasy. It existed. And in the late 19th century, a German archaeologist named Heinrich Schliemann claimed to have found it, layers of ruins buried beneath a hill in modern-day Turkey. So now the question is no longer, did Troy exist? It's, did a war happen there? And was there ever really a Helen, a Paris, an Achilles? To find the truth, we must peel back the poetry and dig into the dust of the Bronze Age. Centuries after the supposed fall of Troy, a blind poet named Homer shaped the war into legend. His epic, the Iliad, composed around the 8th century BCE, became the cornerstone of Greek identity, a story of gods, rage, and doomed heroes. But Homer wasn't writing history. He was preserving memory, shaped, stretched, and sung by generations of storytellers before him. The Iliad doesn't begin with the abduction of Helen. It begins with Achilles' anger, months into the war. Gods walk the battlefield. Heroes duel in single combat. The Greeks are not simply warriors. They are almost mythic beings, larger than life, yet achingly human in their pride, grief, and glory. Homer never claims to have seen these events. He lived nearly 500 years after the war would have taken place. Yet his knowledge of Bronze Age weapons, armour, and customs is striking, far too accurate to be coincidence. Scholars believe Homer may have drawn from oral traditions passed down over centuries, preserving echoes of real conflicts in poetic form. But it's not just the Iliad. Homer's Odyssey follows the aftermath, the long journey home. Other works, now lost or fragmented, told of Achilles' death, the fall of Troy, the Trojan horse, and the sack of the city. Together, these tales formed what was known as the epic cycle. To the ancient Greeks, these weren't fairy tales. They were ancestral memory, a record of a heroic age when gods mingled with men and the fate of nations turned on the honour of a single warrior. The Trojan War became a cultural anchor. Every city-state wanted a piece of it. Kings claimed descent from its heroes. Poets retold the story again and again. But was Homer describing history? Or had centuries of storytelling transformed a local skirmish into a cosmic tragedy? That's the mystery. And it leads us to a quiet hill in modern-day Turkey, where stone, ash, and buried walls may still hold a sliver of the truth. Because sometimes, the line between myth and memory is as thin as a poet's breath. For centuries, Troy was believed to be a myth, a fabled city born from Homer's imagination. But in the late 19th century, a man named Heinrich Schliemann set out to prove otherwise. Driven more by passion than formal training, Schliemann believed the stories were rooted in truth. Guided by Homer's texts, he identified a mound in northwestern Turkey, known as Hisarlik. To the casual eye, it was just a hill. But beneath its surface, layer by layer, lay the buried remains of ancient cities. Not just one Troy, but several. Schliemann began to excavate with urgency, and at times recklessness. He dug deep, past Roman and Hellenistic ruins, until he reached what he believed was the true Troy. There, he claimed to discover Priam's treasure, a collection of gold jewellery and artifacts, which he dramatically declared belonged to the king of Troy himself. He even adorned his wife in them for a photograph, a romantic but highly controversial move. Modern archaeologists later found that Schliemann had dug too deep. The layer he identified dated back to around 2500 BCE, far too early to be the Troy of Homer. But above it, in layer 6 and 7, were cities from the late Bronze Age, around 1300 to 1200 BCE, precisely the era when the Trojan War was said to have occurred. These layers revealed fortified walls, large towers, and signs of destruction by fire. In layer 7, archaeologists found evidence of arrowheads, slingshots, and collapsed buildings, signs of siege or warfare. Could this have been the city that faced the wrath of Mycenaean Greece? Not all scholars agree. Some suggest the destruction was due to an earthquake or a civil conflict rather than an invading army. Others argue the war, if real, was a smaller conflict later expanded into legend. Still, the city at Hisarlik is now widely accepted as the historical Troy, a powerful settlement that controlled trade routes between the Aegean and the East. A city worth fighting for. So perhaps the war was real. Perhaps not as Homer told it, but real enough to inspire 3,000 years of story. And that in itself is a kind of truth. While Troy may have been real, no war could exist without an opposing force. In Homer's story, that force was the mighty coalition of Greek kings. But in historical terms, they would have come from the Mycenaean civilization. The Mycenaeans were the dominant power of mainland Greece during the late Bronze Age, from roughly 1600 to 1100 BCE. They left behind massive palaces, written records, and rich tombs filled with weapons, gold, and art. The most famous of these palaces sat atop a hill in Mycenae, the supposed seat of King Agamemnon, the man who led the Greek forces to Troy. Unlike Homer's tales of honour and fate, Mycenaean society was pragmatic and militaristic. Their palaces were built like fortresses. Their warriors were buried with armour and swords. Their art depicted war chariots, sieges, and soldiers in formation. These were not the loose confederations of later classical Greece. They were centralized kingdoms, run by powerful rulers and an administrative elite. And they weren't isolated. Mycenaean pottery has been found across the eastern Mediterranean, in Egypt, the Levant, and yes, even near Troy. They were traders and seafarers, but also raiders and conquerors. They likely competed for influence and control of coastal cities and key trade routes, especially in western Anatolia, where Troy stood. In Linear B, their early script, we even see signs of a military culture that demanded tribute, recorded taxes, and listed detailed inventories of arms and armour. Though the script offers no mention of a Trojan War, it reveals a world where such a conflict wouldn't have been unusual. So what if the war wasn't over Helen at all? What if it was about control, of trade, of sea lanes, of influence in the east? A real Mycenaean expedition against a rich rival city like Troy wouldn't need gods and romance to justify it. All it would take was power, ambition, and timing. Perhaps the Greeks did sail across the Aegean. Perhaps they laid siege to a city with high walls. And perhaps that story was passed from mouth to mouth, growing with each retelling until it sang of heroes. To understand the Trojan War, we must step into the minds of the people who told it and believed it. The Greeks of the archaic and classical periods didn't separate myth from history the way we do today. To them, the stories of Achilles, Hector, Odysseus, and Helen weren't just entertainment. They were echoes of a heroic past, a golden age when gods walked among men and fate was etched into stone by divine hands. In the Iliad, the gods don't merely observe the war, they participate. Aphrodite protects Paris. Athena guides Achilles. Zeus balances the scales of fate. This divine intervention wasn't a literary device, it was a worldview. The gods were seen as real forces, emotional, unpredictable, and deeply entwined with human affairs. Yet beneath the gods and prophecies are human stories of rage, pride, vengeance, and grief. Achilles isn't just a warrior. He's a young man wrestling with loss and the cost of glory. Hector isn't merely Troy's champion. He's a father and husband who knows he's fighting a war he cannot win. These characters feel alive, precisely because their struggles are timeless. So, where do these figures fall on the spectrum between history and myth? There's no archaeological evidence for Achilles or Helen, no records of a king named Priam or a prince named Paris. But some names, like Alexandros, another name for Paris, do appear in ancient Anatolian texts. And the concept of warrior chiefs, feuding kings, and shifting alliances certainly fits the late Bronze Age world. What seems likely is this: the war, if real, was fought by people who would have looked very different from Homer's heroes, less like demigods in gleaming bronze and more like gritty warlords fighting for territory, tribute, or revenge. But over time, the memory of their struggle became something more. It was told and retold, not just to preserve fact, but to shape identity. For the Greeks, the Trojan War became a mirror, reflecting their values, fears, and dreams. In that way, myth does something history can't. It feels true, even when it isn't. And that is why it endures. If there is one moment from the Trojan War that echoes louder than all others, it is this: the fall of Troy. And at the heart of it lies the most famous trick in Western storytelling, the Trojan horse. According to Homer's later commentators, and told most fully in Virgil's Aeneid, the Greeks, unable to breach Troy's mighty walls after 10 long years, devised a cunning ruse. They pretended to sail away, leaving behind a giant wooden horse as a supposed offering to the gods. The Trojans, weary from war and eager to believe it was over, brought the horse inside the city gates as a trophy. That night, as the city slept, Greek soldiers hidden within the horse emerged, opened the gates, and let in the returning Greek army. Troy was sacked, its temples burned, its people slaughtered or enslaved. Priam, the king, was cut down, and the once mighty city was reduced to rubble, a tragic end to a proud civilization. But did it happen? Archaeology shows that Troy's Seventh, one of the layers uncovered at Hisarlik, was indeed violently destroyed around 1180 BCE. Charred remains, broken walls, and a sudden end to habitation all suggest catastrophe. It fits the timeline. It fits the legend. Yet there is no physical trace of a giant wooden horse, no records of a deception that clever. It may have been a poetic invention, a metaphor for betrayal, or a dramatic flourish added by later poets to give the story its unforgettable climax. Some scholars suggest the horse could have been a misunderstood siege engine, or even a forgotten term for an earthquake or internal revolt. Others believe it never existed at all, that it was a story crafted for symbolic power rather than factual truth. But whether myth or metaphor, the fall of Troy represents something more: the collapse of a world. In the decades following Troy's destruction, many great Bronze Age cities, from Mycenae to Ugarit, also fell. Trade routes broke down, languages vanished, civilizations crumbled. The Trojan War may have been the last great chapter of a fading age, and the horse, whether real or imagined, became the door through which that ancient world stepped into legend. The fall of Troy didn't end the story. In fact, for many ancient audiences, it was just the beginning. The aftermath of the war echoed through the ancient world like a long, sorrowful chord. Homer's Odyssey follows Odysseus, who wandered for 10 years after the war, facing monsters, witches, and the wrath of Poseidon. His journey became a tale of endurance, longing, and the cost of victory. Other heroes met darker fates. Agamemnon, the great king who led the Greeks, was murdered by his wife upon returning home. Ajax took his own life after being dishonored. Menelaus returned to Sparta with Helen, but their reunion, according to some accounts, was cold and distant. And then there was Aeneas, a Trojan prince who, according to Roman mythology, escaped the burning city with his father and young son. His journey, told by the Roman poet Virgil in the Aeneid, took him across the Mediterranean, through storms and battles, until he arrived in Italy. There, he was said to be the forefather of Rome itself. This wasn't just a story, it was political mythology. By claiming descent from the Trojans, the Romans tied their empire to the age of heroes, suggesting their civilization rose not from barbarians, but from survivors of a sacred past. In this way, the Trojan War became more than a Greek legend. It became pan-Mediterranean memory. Every culture wanted a connection to Troy, whether as victors, victims, or inheritors. Cities claimed Trojan founders. Kings boasted of Trojan blood. But what does this tell us about the reality of the war? Perhaps that it mattered far more than just the fighting. Troy, real or not, became a symbol of endurance, of loss, of the rise and fall of nations. And in that symbol, civilizations found meaning, roots, and legitimacy. For the ancient world, Troy wasn't just a city, it was a turning point, a mythic fracture between what was and what would be. And from its ashes rose stories of survival, sorrow, and new beginnings. As centuries passed, the story of the Trojan War was no longer just a tale told by bards. It became a tool. Myth turned into memory, and memory into power. In classical Greece, cities like Athens and Sparta used the Trojan War to define themselves. Athenian playwrights reimagined Helen and Menelaus, not as mere victims or lovers, but as symbols of Greek pride, honour, and sometimes failure. Euripides questioned the morality of the war. Was it really fought for love, or was it a mask for greed and ego? The war became a lens through which Greeks examined their own politics. The struggles of heroes mirrored the debates of democracy. The fall of Troy warned of hubris, of the destruction that comes from excessive pride and vengeance. Later, during the Roman Empire, the myth was reshaped again. Rome claimed descent not from the Greeks, but from the Trojan survivors, casting themselves not as the descendants of conquerors, but as the noble victims who rose from tragedy. Julius Caesar claimed to trace his lineage to Aeneas, and by extension to Venus herself. This was not history. It was myth used for legitimacy, a narrative weapon as sharp as any sword. Even in the modern world, the Trojan War has never truly died. Artists, writers, and filmmakers have retold it again and again, each time reshaping it to reflect new values. Achilles becomes a tragic anti-hero. Helen is seen not as a passive beauty, but a woman caught in forces beyond her control. Paris, once romantic, becomes cowardly. Odysseus, clever and cold. The story evolves. It bends to fit the moment. But every retelling keeps one thing constant. Troy, that burning city by the sea, that dreamscape of love and loss, of pride and ruin. And so, myth becomes more than a tale. It becomes a mirror, reflecting back not what happened, but what each generation needs to believe. Whether fact, fiction, or something in between, the Trojan War remains not because it's proven, but because it's felt. A tale told in every age, to remind us what it means to fight, to fall, and to be remembered. In the end, when we ask whether the Trojan War really happened, we're not just seeking facts. We're chasing something more ancient, more human, meaning. We may never know for certain if Helen truly walked the towers of Troy, or if Achilles fought beneath its walls. No clay tablet names him. No grave has yielded a shield of divine bronze. And yet, we return to the story, again and again, because at its core, the Trojan War isn't about perfect records or irrefutable ruins. It's about the way memory survives when written in emotion, in honour, grief, love, and pride. The details may be blurred, exaggerated, or wholly invented. But something happened. There was a city. There was a war. And from it, a story so powerful, it shaped the identity of civilizations. Historians now believe the war, if it occurred, was likely not a single epic siege, but a series of conflicts over time, fought for access to trade routes, resources, or dominance in the region. Troy may have fallen not from a wooden horse, but from fire and time. Yet the myth refuses to vanish. That's because the truth of Troy lives in two places. One is archaeological, buried in earth, in pottery shards, and broken ramparts. The other is emotional, carried in verses, in songs, in dreams. The poet Homer, whoever he truly was, understood this better than anyone. His words gave us a version of the war that transcends time. His Troy was not just a city, it was a stage for all human drama. Love and loss, glory and ruin, the things that make us ache and remember. So, did the Trojan War really happen? Yes and no. Not in the way we imagine, but not wholly imagined either. It is part truth, part memory, part mirror. And in the space where those overlap, legends are born. Troy may have burned. Its walls may have crumbled, but its story endures. Not because it is perfect, but because it still speaks to the fire we carry inside.